Good afternoon. This is Lee McWhorter again, instructor for the cybersecurity program. Today is welcome. Today is the second lecture for the Security Foundations class today. We're going to go over the last 5 lessons today and cover any of that stuff. And of course, if we have any questions at the end as well, we will do so. And then we will cover that. So last week we covered the first 5 lessons in the Security Foundations intro course. And like I said, this week we're going to cover the next 5. And so I'm looking at my notes here to make sure I'm on the right page. Good deal. We have 5 lessons to cover. That's number 6, further defense concepts. And then lessons 7 and 8 are lessons 7 and 8 are related. They're both on what are called security frameworks. We mentioned those briefly last week. We'll go into some detail on them this week, talk about the most important ones. And then we go into a fair amount more detail on threat actors, looking at some of their attributes, and we also cover non-human threat actors. And then the last lesson, if you will, is organizational security basics. And so we'll be looking at some of the things that kind of bring all this together for us in the sense of organizational security, some of the practices that we use to make sure an organization is secure. So those are the lessons we're going to go over, and we're going to hit the high levels. Like we said, these lectures are intended to supplement. And so I want to just kind of hit the highlights. In lesson 5, other defense concepts, when we ended last week, we were talking about things like defense in depth and security and layered defenses and rotation of duties and all these kind of good things. And so this continues on with some of these additional security concepts. There are 4 main ones that we'll talk about: diversity, limiting, obscurity, and simplicity. And I'm going to take them slightly out of order. I'm going to leave obscurity till the very end. So let's talk about diversity. What does diversity entail? Well, in a security concept, in the framework of, let's say, like an organizational network, the idea of having layered defenses that we talked about, we might have a firewall, we might have some intrusion detection, we might have different types of equipment and policies and procedures in place to define how we set up that equipment and make sure we monitor and make sure we're actively monitoring what's going on as traffic comes in and out of our network. But while we may have that layered defense, another thing we can sort of, I hate to say it, but layer onto it is what we call diversity. And the idea with diversity is that we want to make sure that in addition to having layers, we want to have differences, different types of mechanisms. And this can include both using equipment from different vendors, for example. So instead of, say, going with all Cisco or all Palo Alto or all whatever vendor it may be, Juniper equipment, for example, that instead we decide we want to have I lost my student there. Hopefully he'll be back in a second. We want to have, maybe a firewall from one of those equipment, maybe a next generation firewall. We want to have routers from a different vendor, and et cetera. And then even when we talk about the policies and procedures we use to implement security on our network, we want to have some diversity in that. We'll talk a little bit later about these different frameworks. These frameworks provide us some guidelines and some best practices and things like that that we can use to implement within our security plan for our organization. And so what we can do is, many times, as we'll talk about, we end up taking elements from multiple of these frameworks. And so we have diversity in our policies and procedures, we have diversity in our equipment, and by adding that diversity, then we have a better defense. It's less likely, like if you use the same vendor for every piece of equipment on your network, and then there is some kind of zero-day backdoor exploit that is found in some bug that's found across, say, the operating system that underlies all that equipment, then you might find your routers and your firewall and all kinds of stuff being able to be penetrated, exploited by one potential bug out there. And so you run into the issue of obviously having a very simple network, which is something we're going to talk about, and that's good in its own way. But because of the too much simplicity, too much dependent on one vendor, we've put our network at risk. Whereas if we had used a couple different vendors there and a couple different sets of policies, then the odds that an attacker can get through all of those layers of defense and all of those different vendors and providers is much diminished. Now, The next concept is one that applies both to, it applies all throughout the network actually, and the concept is called limiting. The idea with limiting is many of us have probably heard the phrase least privilege before, and the idea being that we want to, in almost in all areas, whether that's file permissions, access to certain network shares, definitely access to equipment, access to command line, access to root level or escalated level administrative privileges. We want to make sure that a person in the organization, or even a piece of equipment, a segment of the network, we want to limit what we can do with that. So for example, it's pretty common in say the basic network sharing that sometimes in the startup organizations, it's okay, we're going to create this share, we're going to share it out to the whole company. And that by default is not limiting. That's completely open. And that's the easiest thing to do. We've talked about how security, we talked last week about how security versus convenience is kind of a trade-off. And so it's obviously much more convenient to just have a big share and share it to the whole company. But that means that everyone has access to that, and accidentally or maliciously or whatever, maybe they've gotten a virus on their machine, then like a crypto virus, they could encrypt all of that in that share. And so that's not ideal. What we want to do is we want to sort of figure out and do an analysis within an organization how we limit access to different things. So we want to limit access to files based on what people need. We want them to be able to do their jobs. We want them to have access to the information they need, but nothing else. And then the same thing applies even as you move up into your IT and your security organization. You want to make sure that you don't just have every administrator has all power to everything. That kind of violates that whole rotation of duty and separation of duties anyway. But we want to make sure that, say more junior admins that are managing a certain server or a certain process, say email, they have the power and the rights on that server to do what they need to do to add users and clean a stuck mailbox and clean up stuff. But they don't necessarily need all of the power. And the same thing, only certain people should have access to, say, the routers or other kinds of equipment. Welcome back. And so we want to use limiting across the organizational network. We want to limit the ability for people to access files and shares and things on the network, only give them what they need. We want to make sure that various pieces of equipment are locked down and that only certain people have access to those. And we can, of course, have layers of that, which is all part of layered security. Certain people may have access to a machine and have a certain layer of administrative rights so they can do their job, but the overriding super user account is limited down to a couple other people. And so limiting can be applied at the network layer, the file layer, at individual equipment layer. It can also be looked at at the network layer from the point of view of who has access to what segments, especially as you build a bigger network. You don't necessarily just want everything wide open and everybody can surf to every other part. Sure, they need to be able to reach common servers. Sure, people might want to, in some cases, be able to share, but security requirements are going to mean that we want to lock down certain areas. So many times it's common if we have a software development team that they're isolated off maybe on their own network, and while they can get outside and they can send email and they can get to the common shares on the servers out there, most people can't get into their machines, into their repositories, into their testing systems because they're locked down by the limiting concept. So then the next one is simplicity. So here we have talked about doing all these things. We got layered defenses. We're layering different types of equipment and procedures. Now we're using diversity by using equipment from different vendors and using different policies and procedures potentially from different frameworks. And we're putting all these rules in place as to who can access what. And by definition, we're adding more complexity to our network. And while there's an element of we almost have to, we can't just say, okay, we're going to go complete convenience and just let everything be open, then we have no security. On the same token, we can't, as many IT people would like to do, for example, we don't want to make it so complex in the process of trying to build these other pieces into our network, or when we put an individual policy in place, we don't necessarily want to overcomplicate it, because what you'll see happen is people will work around it, basically. A great classic example is the sort of password policies of the world. Most security/IT admins are generally going to want passwords that are 250 characters, alternating letters and numbers and symbols. They have to be changed every 24 hours. That would be absolutely secure. But of course, the burden on our users would be more than most of them are willing to do. And so they would either rebel against it, push back to management, not do it, not change their passwords, and we'd have all these issues. And of course, many times if the password, say, talking about a subset of administrators, let's say that certain people need to access a certain server because of our limiting and our policy. We've only let certain people have access. And let's say we've made that overly complex as far as they're concerned, or maybe even for the situation. There's 2 sign-offs they have to get into that server. Then what's going to happen is admin Sue is going to hand her password to admin Bill when he needs to do it, and they're not going to go through that procedure. And then when you have to go do an audit, now you've made the system overly complex, they've circumvented it, and when you look in, it looks like Sue did all this, but really Sue's been sharing her password to make it easier to get the job done. And so simplicity is sort of that concept that we use to balance all the other ones, where we're saying, okay, we've added different layers and vendors, we've added different types of policies, we've put in what we place, but we also need to come back and look at it through the lens of simplicity. Have we made this system simple enough that it does the job, but it's not so overcomplicated that people are going to try to work around it? And so, and generally speaking, a simpler system is more likely to be implemented and more likely to be traceable and auditable going forward within reason. Now, there are always exceptions. I mean, I had a student years ago at another institution that worked for one of the big lottery gaming companies in this country, and they ran lotteries all over. And he worked in one of their NOCs, and I remember him telling me about when they needed somebody, when somebody actually needed to do some work on the live gaming servers, not development, not all this other, but the true live system. They had a really complex process that was required to let somebody in. They had that person needed to file a request with their own manager to get a 15-minute, by the way, chunk of time on that server to do whatever they needed to do, apply a patch, fix something, whatever. That then had to be approved by another manager. Both of these were signed off and documented in the system, and then an allocated amount of time was given to that admin to go in and do that work. But while he or she was in the system, he or she was being watched by another admin in real time, and that's what my student's job was. He sort of managed the NOC, oversaw things, and when one of these developers or one of these people needed to get into the live system, he would literally be watching their screen keystroke for keystroke to make sure. Now, obviously, somebody could get in and change the lottery or some of these games and make themselves millions of dollars. There's huge risk. And so given the security requirements that the governments have put in place to license these lotteries, they have had to go down to that level of security. And it makes sense for their organization. But, the average mail server probably doesn't need a 2 sign-off process to have somebody go in and delete a user account. So once again, we've got to balance the complexity of our network and the needs against the need of not overcomplicating it. Now, the last of the topics that's a little out of order, but I wanted to save till last, is what's called obscurity. Obscurity is a very interesting defense concept in that it's actually kind of controversial. There are probably about as many people in the field that say it is a complete waste of time as there are people who say it adds value. And you'll have to do all the reading and do the assignments and decide whether you think it has any value and where you might find it. In full disclosure, I'm in the camp that thinks it has at least some degree of value. So what is obscurity? Obscurity is the idea that a system can be maintained secure if, in a sense, nobody really knows about it except for, say, the inner team. So like if an application was developed or a new program was being written for whatever internal or external use, and the core team who knew how it worked and knew its protocols and knew its mechanisms, and they kept that and no one else knew about it, then it would be secure. Now, the reality is it's hard to keep secrets. And while obviously secrets are a key piece of what we do with security, we have secret passwords, we have secret keys, we have all kinds of stuff. Secrets are important, but as history has shown, secrets are hard to maintain. Secrets get out, people whistleblow, people disclose, the information becomes public years later, whatever the case is, depending on whether it's a public or private or governmental organization. But it's hard to maintain secrecy. But the idea with security is that if you can maintain that secrecy of that system, of that network, of that application, that it should be fairly secure if only those few people know. Now, the way I look at it, though, is not so much in an absolute, like security doesn't work at all or obscurity doesn't work at all, as some people think. Some people think there's no way to maintain secrets. Things will get out. People will, especially in this day of open source, everything's out there. It's harder and harder to keep secrets. Programmers and developers move all the time. People move all the time, different companies. And so maybe parts of that secret is lost over time as they move around and is shared on forums or discussed or supported on a support site. And so an attacker could slowly but surely begin to ferret out reverse engineer and figure out that secrecy. And so the people who feel like it's of no value feel like that's what happens. And then on the other hand, there's people who, think it can add value. Like I said, I think it adds a little value, and I'll give you an example. We mentioned last week that one of the big groups of attacks and responsible for a lot of attacks are just the script kiddies, bots, and young kids, young people, amateurs that are just starting out. They're downloading some attack tool, they grab it, they start attacking all these different sites. And these scripts are, generally speaking, if they're going to work at all, they're going to work on what I like to call the low-hanging fruit. The people who haven't changed their default passwords or are using crappy passwords, the people who have left things at default settings on various services, or they haven't patched something so they find an old out-of-date version. And so these scripts and these little tools are generally written, and especially in the hands of an inexperienced person, are going to kind of do the default things. So if they're attacking the web, they're going to attack the web on port 80, for example. If they're attacking FTP, they're going to attack on that port. And so using a little bit of obscurity where it's appropriate can sometimes, in my opinion, add a little value. If, say, for example, we had a website that was not our publicly facing to the whole world, we would want to leave it working on port 80, etc., because we wouldn't want users out there trying to get to our site to have to put in some custom port number to get to our website. But maybe we can use a DNS entry and an alias, and we can make an internal website, or one that's mainly meant for internal purposes, operate on port, say, 8080. That's not really the best example because a lot of people use 8080, but maybe just some other weird number we pick, and then we map to it through DNS or routing, or have our developers know they need to go there to hit that test site, whatever. Now, if it's publicly accessible and somebody does full port scans, or somebody who's really a knowledgeable hacker starts feeling it, they'll figure out that that web server is running on 7,000 instead of 80 as port. But the reality is, that's somebody truly targeting you, and you're going to have layers of defenses to defend against that, to be able to detect it, like with intrusion detection. But those low end, you're not going to be the low hanging fruit. So all these attack scripts that are going out there and hitting port 80 to see if they can do things is just going to fail on that test server for you. And so all of those attacks are useless because you're not operating at that port, and you obscured where you're operating. And so there are times, I think, fairly narrow and slightly over into the net positive category, where security can be of value. But it is a very controversial topic in the field, but it is one to be covered and one that's tested about as well, especially on the exam. So then those are the four main topics in lesson 5, and the most important ones that we cover, and give some additional examples. So if we move on, I'm going to combine 7 and 8 into one discussion here in the interest of time, and because they relate to each other. In 7, we start off talking about security frameworks. The industry provides, or I should say industries, there's lots of different ones out there. There are lots of organizations who provide these security frameworks, and these frameworks are a collection of policy guidelines and checklists, and sometimes they have sample, even templates of, say, acceptable use policy or whatever, and they vary. Different organizations put them out. You will see as you learn about them that there are all kinds. There are industry organizations. One we're going to talk about in great detail is the payment card industries, the credit card industry standard. That's one that a large majority of companies have to at least adhere to. Then there's all kinds of other industry ones for financial or technical. And then, of course, a lot of them are put out by regulatory bodies. And so we talk about a number of them in the course. And I'm going to throw out some initials like NIST, the National Institutes of Standards. It's the U.S. government, or ISO. Many of you may have heard of ISO. Maybe you've burned an ISO file. Well, that's the International Standard Organization, at least the way it's sort of commonly referred to. The reality is the organization is called ISO. They are not called any combination. They actually point out on their website that if they had chosen International Standards Organization, then that would have led to their an abbreviation being different in different languages around the world. So they just chose the letters ISO. And so we have like ISO 9000, a certification process for manufacturers and quality. We have ISO file format being the CD format that some of you may have used. And the ISO organization puts out a lot of security standards we may follow. There are obviously many countries that put out their own standards. The EU has one. We'll talk about that. And so there are all these different standards. And then the first one we really talk about specifically is what's called PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry's digital standards on security for credit card processing. And so this is an industry body that has put together a base outline, a security framework, if you will, that anyone who processes, accepts, or uses credit cards needs to follow. And as a matter of fact, if you don't ultimately follow it, if you're found not in compliance, there can be fees. And of course, maybe more importantly, for some organizations, you can lose your right to process credit cards. And so this one that we'll look at in great detail in lesson 7, and you'll have some exercises around that to become familiar with it. It is an important framework. The vast majority of companies these days take credit cards in some form or fashion. Payment cards, even if you're doing like Apple Pay, that's still tied to a credit card. And so the rules of the PCI's digital standards have to be in place. So you need to make sure you've met those minimal standards within your organization. Of course, the reality is, most organizations do much more. They're not only just a credit card accepting company, but they're in a certain industry. They're in healthcare, they're in technology, they're in whatever. So we're going to look at some of these other industry standards as well. And then it's important to be aware of the big international and international standards like NIST. We have ETSI, which is the European Technical Standards Body. We have a number of other industry ones like ISA, Corbett, etc. And all of these are different frameworks, and there's no right or wrong, really. I mean, if your industry is in healthcare, then you probably should look at the healthcare industry security frameworks and make sure you're implementing best practices and you're following the credit card. If you take credit cards, so you got to follow that. Maybe you look at the national one and you blend together parts of each of these frameworks to build your organizational security policy. And so multiple of them may have an acceptable use template. Maybe you even blend those together to write your own acceptable use, or you throw them all out and write your own. But the idea is that you'll have these templates and starters and guidelines and checklists and best practices that you can work your way through. And if you end up picking as an organization, especially if you're ever in the place of, say, working for an up and coming company that is fully starting their security policy, then you would do this from the beginning. You would look at all the different security frameworks and standards that might apply towards your organization. And then you literally can pick and choose sort of, okay, well, we like this one works. We're going to use this acceptable use policy. We're going to follow this best practice. We're going to use this outline. We're going to combine these elements and tools from these different frameworks, and we're going to build our organizational security policy based off of all those. And we're going to make sure along the way that, yes, we've covered PCI DSS, we've covered the healthcare one if we're in that field, we'll cover the financial requirements if we're in that field, we'll cover other requirements. Now, one thing I always like to point out, and we pointed out in the text as well, but in the lessons online, but just because you're a US-based company or a European-based company, obviously you should look at that national standard, like the NIST standard or the ETSI standard in Europe, and they would add value to your organization building their own security policy. But just because you're one or the other, you're a European company or you're a US company, many times people will ask, well, do I need to look at those other standards? I'm a US company. Should I just use the NIST, follow it, and maybe PCI and anything else that applies and go from there? And I always tell clients and people, you need to take a look at the European standards. The European security standards in some cases are more, they have a little bit stronger privacy rights when it comes to and regulations on where data can be stored and how things have to be disclosed, say if a breach or an event happens. And you may think I'm just a US company, but if you've got a website and you take money from that website, maybe you sell products like Amazon, or maybe you're a nonprofit and you take donations and somebody from Europe donates to you, or somebody from Europe starts buying your product and you have these clients, then you better have been aware of those standards from Europe and potentially incorporated them in, so that you're making sure that you're following those standards and following those regulatory requirements. So 7 and 8 are kind of combined there in a quick overview, but like I said, there are a number of them. 7 is really about the sort of frameworks in general, and then specifically about PCI DSS, which is hugely important. The vast majority of people will need to be aware of that, not only for testing, but because where you go to work, the vast majority of the time they're going to be taking credit cards or processing them in some way, shape, or form. And then 8 talks about in detail some of the other more commonly used in our fields, in the tech fields, frameworks, from ISO to NIST to Corbett, on and on. And I won't bore you with all those because they're all, in a sense, versions of the same thing. They are a collection of documents and guidelines and checklists, etc., that can help an organization build their own security policy. So you'll take a look at some of those and dig a little deeper into those in the coursework. So then moving on, our last 2 lessons for The second part of the Security Foundations course is threat actors and detail. And so we've already talked about threat actors a little bit last week, at least at the highest level. We talked about script kiddies and nation state actors and criminal players, criminal hackers, and how things have really changed from an innocent or early days of doing it to kind of learn and show off to now it's really being driven about money. But we want to look a little more in detail about these different types of threat actors, because it's important to understand, like I've mentioned before, the script kiddies are responsible for a huge amount of the traffic that is attack related traffic. But the reality is they're kind of the easiest to deal with. Not only can you do some obscurity possibly and move some ports and things like that, but just standard best practices really pretty much eliminate them from being much of a threat. If you put the default passwords in place, you change default passwords, I should say not put in place, but put in a policy that you're changing default passwords, and you're making sure you're following your policy and guidelines for configuring firewalls and routers and equipment and locking things down, then the kind of common attacks that, and of course maintaining patching and up to date, then the common things that these script kiddies are going after, they're usually not obviously a script kiddie is not downloading a pre-canned tool to attack people that's already got a 0-day exploit. That's not out there. The tools they're using are things that are known. They've been out for a while. And so the only way they're going to get somebody, which they will, because not everybody updates and not everybody changes their default passwords. That's the problem. So you don't want to be that low-hanging fruit. And so if you follow the very basics of best practices of changing default passwords, setting up base configurations, staying patched, staying secure, and monitoring, then the odds that a script kiddie, a very low-resourced kid in his basement of the classic story, packing away using some off-the-shelf tool, the odds they're going to get into you are very, very slim if you just follow the basics. But then, of course, as you scale up to the other types of actors, criminal actors, nation-state actors, terrorist-sponsored actors, then these become a little more challenging. There are less per se than there are of the script kiddies, but there are things to be aware of. And if you, for whatever reason, or your organization has drawn the attention of some of these types of, then you're looking at having a larger challenge on your hand. Once again, all of those best practices and basics will help prevent any trouble from them, but they're going to look further. And so this is where monitoring and really staying up on things, as I always say, if you're not looking at your logs, you're not doing your job. So we're going to, and if we have a class on logging and monitoring actually later in the program, where we teach you all aspects of how to look at logs, to integrate them and bring them together and have unified systems to manage and monitor all this, especially as network size grows. So you have to be taking things beyond just those basics to avoid being able to be targeted by the bigger guys. And we have to be aware that once you go beyond script kiddies, you're usually getting into some more sophisticated players. You're also getting into some more well-funded players, especially if they're nation state. You probably read some of the articles, maybe. I read them all the time. They're North Korea, China, US, Israel, all kinds of, most countries actually now have some form of a cyber group, and they're out there trying to spy and break in for spying and industrial espionage and all kinds of reasons. And of course, if you're in one of those industries and some foreign attackers are attacking you, then they're just not going to use the off-the-shelf tools. They're going to dig a little deeper. They're going to really probe your network. They're going to look for more vulnerabilities than just and they're going to try things like spear phishing to try to get in. They're going to try multiple attacks. They're going to be analyzing you. There's some, sadly, they're neat. From a security point of view, they're sad to the folks that it happened to, but I know of a group that was attempting to get into programmers. And so instead of attempting to attack Google and Microsoft and all these people directly, who they, at least perceived to have a fairly decent security front end, they instead started looking around and thinking, how can we reach these same people? Oh, well, it turns out that there's sites out there for programmers that are forums where we programmers, just like there are for security, other fields, we go and we talk, we hang out, we talk, we ask questions, we ask, well, how about this code? And so these attackers are wanting to attack, they joined these sites as developers, started paying attention to who was posting and what questions they were asking, getting an idea of what they were working on and who they were, where they worked. And then, of course, they were able to then take some of that information and begin to fake some very targeted spear phishing campaigns where they made it look like that somebody that person had been talking to on the forum was communicating with them, maybe with additional information. Oh, here's a zip file with some code. I think it'll fix your problem. And the person opens it up possibly, and they actually were successful in basically getting some access as they tried to target those programmers. We've seen all kinds of things like that where these more sophisticated hackers will take a few steps away before coming back and circling back. They'll find a place you're involved in, they'll find another organization you're involved in. I think I mentioned last week, I use some of the examples because they come from my experience, but a client that that kind of attack, a spear phishing attack, cost them some money because it looked like it had come from one person, one family member to another, and they actually, had attacked a nonprofit to use that as the launching pad for the attack into the corporate. And so the more experienced attack threat actors and are more experienced, they're more funded, and they have led to a term, even what we can call persistent threat, that they are not just like a script kiddie who's going to run their script, it's going to blow by, hit all your servers, and if they get lucky, they get in to somebody, they will, hopefully not you, because you followed the best practices, and then they go on. But these guys, these more experienced attackers, are constantly looking for ways in. They're looking at outside the box, if you will. They're trying social engineering, spear phishing, trying to research you and your employees on other forums. And so all of this can then be used to try to target your organization. And so the other thing, though, that's a big piece, besides understanding sort of the different types and, script kiddies, amateurish, a little bit less finance, nation state actors, very professional, very highly financed and resourced, and there are different people in the middle. It's important to understand these because depending on what type of threat actor is really sort of attacking your organization, then you may have different responses, and of course you'll have different layers to catch. Like I said, most of the script kiddie stuff, if you do the right things in the first place, you can avoid their trouble. I get a kick out of seeing, for example, it's a very common, you would almost think they've given up by now, but I assume it still works occasionally. But it's very common to see brute force attacks from various tools out there that try to log in as the root user or the administrator user. And so I really get a kick when I see, it doesn't last long, systems block it, but when I see an attempt with one of these tools against one of my servers, and it's using administrator, I snicker because I run on all Linux servers on the internet. And so administrator is a useless word. There's no account. That's a Windows user they're trying to attack. So you can tell they don't even know what server they just told it to attack all those IPs, and they're looking for a weak Windows server, but they'll hit anything. So obviously I have no Windows servers, so no threat. Well, I have lots of Linux servers, so it's not uncommon to see root being attacked a lot. Well, the first thing I do on every Linux box I've ever put anywhere in the world is disallow root from remotely logging in. That user is not allowed to log in. So once again, it becomes a useless, even if they somehow guess the password, the SSH is set up to not allow that user in at all. And so these basic, changing the passwords, setting restrictions, limiting access, all these basic things makes the script kiddies almost not a threat at all, unless I guess somebody just gets totally lucky. But from most big organizations, they're just a nuisance. It's the other types you need to be aware of, and they require a little bit more thought. They require making sure I'm doing more than just the basics, and that I'm monitoring to make sure I don't see suspicious activity, because they may be doing something that's not known out there, and that's the thing we have to be aware of. Now, the last part of that session, lesson 9 on threat actors, actually does present a new concept that's very important to understand. We have talked about threat actors up till this point as if they were all human. And of course, script kiddies, whether they're old or young, if they're just trying out hacking for the first time, they're human. And of course, these nation state actors, generally humans. Now we are seeing more and more bots, and there's a large discussion, which is not for this class for today, but just something to plant the seed. You might want to read about and keep an eye out. But there's a lot of fear that AI is going to really, of course, it could work both sides. It's going to help us on defense. It's going to help them on attack. I think it's going to be the standard cat and mouse game until I guess AI takes over completely. But as an interim, using these tools, machine learning can help us defend, machine learning can help them attack. So we're going to see potentially another war and an arms race between the attackers and the defenders within this space, just around AI. But that's a different topic for another time. So all these other actors up till now have been human actors. But we do have to put up one more category in the threat actors, which we actually call non-human threat actors. And this is anything that can affect the security and operation of our network that is non-human. And so the best example is a big natural disaster. Everybody can kind of relate to that. If you live in certain places, the West Coast, and you don't take earthquakes into account as part of your planning for your security and your risk management and your disaster recovery and your business continuity planning, which we'll talk a little bit about all those here in a second, so you'll see how this all ties. If you're not taking into account earthquakes, then you fail, because an earthquake's going to happen. They do happen. It may just be a small one. It may be a huge one again. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the big one to take your organization offline. If you live on the coast, especially the East Coast, but a little bit still on the West, you got to worry about big storms and hurricanes and call them typhoons over in the Pacific, whatever. These things have to be factored into your equations. You have to plan for these non-human threat actors. Depending upon where you operate, and I mean in a rural sense, your company may have offices all over the world. You could have a riot someplace, shut down and not let you have access to that facility. And that could even happen in the States, but definitely you could have wars that affect your operations. We have had accidents that sometimes need to be taken into account. Somebody doing some dredging has cut an internet cable. And if that's the main cable from that part of whatever Asia, Africa that you happen to have a facility at, and that could happen, what's your backup? You're now isolated. Your one point is out. Do you have a backup? Do you satellite connectivity at least is keep up and running? What is your plan? So we have to keep these non-human threat actors in mind just as much as the human threat actors. So the last lesson then is a meaty one, and it's really, really important because it somewhat brings this first lesson together, or first course together, Security Foundations, and it provides a big chunk of information that you'll see referenced in other courses and that you will definitely see again in your future, not only in, say, a Security Plus test or any other testing, but also and just in the organizational. That's the whole point of this. Sure, it's great to learn how to attack and defend and all these things and learn these basic concepts, but there's a purpose to it. And organizational security is that purpose. What we're trying to do with all this we're learning is apply it to our organization so that we can make the organizational system and IT and network and assets as secure as possible. And so, excuse me. One of the big things you have to get used to is the word controls. At the base, it's sort of at where the rubber hits the road in organizational security is the controls. And a control is anything that an organization does, anything it puts in place. A password policy, a lockout procedure, a physical lock on a door, whatever the case may be. These are controls that are part of security. And so there can be all different types of controls. They can be preventative. So that lock on the door is preventative. It's going to prevent somebody from getting into that closet and messing with that router. We can have detective controls. A good example of that might be that policy where if you fail your password a few times, it locks you out, and usually it gets locked out. Maybe an email gets sent to an administrator. So we're detecting potentially and also preventing, in that case, this attack onto that system. And then we can have corrective controls, and these get a little more elaborate in many cases, though it depends on. For example, intrusion prevention can kick in here, where we have rules in place that if we detect certain activities, that we actually do something. We shut off that connectivity, we close down that port, we block that IP, and it happens correctively. You can also look at different types of controls in another way, whether they are physical controls, procedural, technical, legal. So a physical control, like I mentioned already, is that lock on a door. And one of the biggest things that it sometimes surprises me in this modern world, but it does happen. People will forget about the basics. They've changed all their default passwords. They got the best firewall in the world, and then they don't put a lock on the server room door, or they don't have a procedure in place to prevent unauthorized people from accessing in a physical capacity, or don't just have the basic alarm cameras and security systems in place. I may have mentioned, this uses one of my examples of a company out in California that they had been targeted a lot, and apparently whoever wanted their data wanted it enough that they just drove up, broke in the window, and walked out with hard drives. So there's ways to, you need to protect the full 360. So we have physical controls, locks, cameras, and those types of things, maybe passes, depending on our need. We have technical controls like our login, lockout things, and then of course all of the procedures. That's one of the reasons we're in organizational security. We're going to put together a security plan for that company, and that's going to start at a very high level, talking about our our desires, what we're trying to protect, what risk we're willing to accept, all the way down to detailed documents like, here's the policy for how you set up a new computer. Here's the policy for how you set up a new firewall. Here's our firewall rules documented. They're going to be applied to all of our external facing firewalls, and we check them and tested them. If we make a change, we go through another process of testing and changing before we roll those out live. We have password policies, acceptable use policies. All of this comes together under this umbrella of organizational security. And so an organization is going to attempt to take all of this, all that you're learning in this program and all that is in the field, and bring it down and distill it into their own security organizational policy. And it will have a high level like strategy document. It will have a middle level procedure documents, all the way down to very detailed policies of your password must be within these things. And so when you do this, though, a business has to go through a process. And most of the time, and many of you, when you go out in the field, you'll go work for a company that has already done this initially. But don't worry, you'll get to use this stuff anyway, because security policy is a never ending. It's not a goal, it's a method, it's a process. So we're not having a case of the, we write our policy, throw it out there and never change it. Instead, we always are updating it, etc. And so, and then of course, if you do go work, say, for a smaller company, a startup, you're racing fast, you get going, at some point, there is the need to put this into place. And so one of the first things that a company will do, and this can either be, like I said, if they're updating an existing policy or starting from scratch, is they're going to take an inventory of what all do we have. We have so many servers, so much equipment. What kind of data do we have? Do we need to come up with a classification like the government does, secret, top secret, or private, not private, public? Do we need to come up with a classification scheme for our data, depending on the type and types of data we have? That'll impact policy. Obviously, we're going to be more secure on the top secret data than we are on the public data, etc. And so we look at our inventory, we take a look at everything that we have, and then we begin to look at our organization and we do a risk analysis. What are our risks? Okay, we know we have all these servers, we have all these machines, we have all these servers, we have all these people, we have all these systems. What are the risks there? If we have a website, is there a risk that it'll be attacked? Well, there's absolutely a possibility that it'll be attacked. As a matter of fact, my experience says that you will be attacked, even if it's just the script kiddies and some automatic looking for something. One of my favorite attacks on the web is, I don't generally run WordPress. It's a fine system, I guess, if that's what you like, but I find it very vulnerable. It gets attacked a lot, and I can go look on the web logs for the sites I've hosted or host for myself. And every so often you'll see a hit on the web /WP admin. I don't have WordPress on that site. Why are they? Well, it's a bot just trying to see if they can find the admin login at the default location, which is advised you move, of course, and then if they can, they're going to attempt to crack in. And WordPress has a number of vulnerabilities, both sometimes on the back end. One of my favorite WordPress stories was a WordPress site hosted at GoDaddy. The problem with the big hosts like that many times is they're shared hosting. And so even though the person I knew who had created the account for their company and was managing it, they had chosen WordPress, even despite my recommendation not to use it. But they said, okay, we take all you're going to say. We're going to make sure we go in there every day and we make sure it's updated, and we're going to keep our eye on it. And they did, and they were doing everything exactly right. And then they still got stuff. They literally had where one of their clients went to search on Google for them to find the directions to go visit. And they had that warning from Google, you don't want to go to this site, it's delivering out malware. And so when they dug into it, they got me involved to help figure it out. What it turned out had happened, of course, is they were at the base level of GoDaddy hosting, no extra features. They had done everything within their sort of bucket and virtual host site to maintain their WordPress and update it and do everything they should have done. But because all their site, along with thousands of others, were on basically the same server rack, and they were going back to a common MySQL or whatever database in the background to power the dynamic WordPress generation, then of course somebody down here, somebody else on that server farm didn't update their site. They threw up their site 6 months ago. They never clicked the update button. And then over time, of course, that older out of date site now was known to have a vulnerability, and somebody came in and swept in through that site, did some SQL injection and injected entries into all of the databases, so that even though my friend and client had a perfectly secure site and WordPress front end, somebody else on that shared host was able to inject code in, and then everybody on that shared server farm, all those sites were being blocked by Google because they were serving malware because it had been injected into the backend database. So we have to do a risk assessment. We have to look at our setup. We have to look at the risk from vendors. We may look at service level agreements. What are they giving us? They had to upgrade quite substantially with GoDaddy to get more isolation and better protection for future. And that's one of those things that we want to try to avoid by doing this process in the first place. We want to look at it and look at our risk. And of course, the risks are going to vary. One of the most complex things that I think people don't get about risk assessment is that ideally, there's two ways to do it. You can just do it kind of at a conceptual level. Okay, we have a web server, and yes, we know there's vulnerabilities that are out there and potential threats, hackers and bots and scripts. And so we're going to then say, yes, we have a website and we know there's known vulnerabilities, known threats out there. So this is going to be on our risk sheet. But you have a mail server, you have a firewall, you have an external, you have multiple offices, you have VPN, whatever you have, and you put these all down. Well, you've identified all your risk. Okay, yes, I have these things and I know there's potential threats, but how do you rank them? Well, you can either do it kind of conceptually and look at it kind of on a sort of high, medium, and low impact, kind of a business impact or business risk analysis kind of approach, or ideally you put dollar amounts to it. And so, for example, I have a website for my company, let's say, and my website is mainly just, here's what we do and here's who we are, come check us out, here's our contact page, give us a call, we'll give you a quote. Beautiful, cool, I got my site. And then this other person over here has their site is making $10,000 an hour. So we both have done our risk assessment and we looked at, yes, we both have websites and we know there's known threats, but and then let's say we're identical. We both have VPN, we have multiple offices. So we look at those risk assessments and just on the surface, they're the same. But the reality is, of course, if nothing else, taking the web example, this guy's making $10,000 an hour, I'm getting a few leads. I'm not going to spend as much money or rank the impact to my business, the business impact analysis part. I'm going to rank that lower. And so whether I just do that as low, medium, and high and end up with a ranking that way, or we really put dollar amounts to it. And if we take that dollar amount example, for example, we know what's happening over here. He's lost $10,000 if he goes down an hour. But the reality is that it's really more than that, because in that same hour, some people came or would have come and say maybe bookmarked and shown their significant other later, hey, we want to buy this. What do you think? And so that didn't happen either. So they lost some future sales. Some people were just coming potentially to look. They might have bought, maybe not, but they weren't able to get in. So they lost those possible sales and possibly future customers. And of course, then there's the time, the overtime to fix it. We got to restore from backup. We got to put another server up, whatever it is. And so we have to put those costs in. And over here, I've got, okay, maybe I lost a few sales because I didn't get that potential quote. It bounced the email, my site was down. And so I can put a dollar amount to mine. And once again, we can go through that process. So there's really kind of two ways. At the highest level, we just do it kind of high, medium, and low assessments and ranking. And that's better than nothing, because at least, once again, this company is going to rank their web much higher than I am because they make $10,000 an hour and I don't. But on the same token, I might rank the risk of my VPN. Maybe I have a lot more remote employees, and I'm really concerned that because of that if we leave somebody hanging, or we let go somebody and we don't change their account, or just because we have so many more users than this other place, that our VPN is a bigger risk to us. We better maybe put encryption, public key encryption in various things. I mean, there's already encryption in VPN, but our login, our authentication maybe needs to be up higher than just sort of a shared passphrase to avoid that input. So each organization has to go through that inventory and assessment. They do a risk assessment, and then that becomes a business impact analysis where we've identified the risk. Now we try to put rank it based on the impact to our business. And then ultimately, all of this information feeds into which of those frameworks we use. Okay, we're in the financial services industry. We got to look at that. We're a U.S. company, but we do have European. Let's take a look at those two frameworks. We got credit cards. Let's take the DCS. Let's take all these frameworks, lay them out. Let's take a look at them. Okay, we need to follow that. Let's take this. Let's take these pieces. And then we ultimately build our own security strategy. We have our strategy, we have our high-level position paper, we have our policy papers that apply to different areas, all the way down to our individual procedure that tell us how to change our password or set up a router. And we build that. In addition, there are a couple more pieces and a couple more last key terms as we wrap up here, and then I have a little time for questions. Doing pretty good. And that is, once you've got that security plan in place, once you have your procedures and everything underneath that down, so you're up and running, you're going, cool. Well, we have a few things we have to keep in mind last. And one is that, I mentioned it when I was talking about non-human threat actors, we have to make sure that we are able to continue the business. And so we then do go through a process we call business continuity planning, where we look at how can we maintain the organizational for example, what happens for this company over here if their website goes down? What is the business continuity planning? Do they have a hot site, spare website ready to go, replicated, and they just flip a switch, redirect over here to DNS, and this one comes up instantly? Well, that would be great. Their downtime would be minimal. They've decided that was worth it. But of course, making $10,000 an hour, and maybe it costs you $10,000 to set up another server and keep it powered and replicated and live all the time. Is that worth it? You really haven't made any savings, right? If it only cost you $1,000 to prevent $10,000, then that's worth doing. If it cost you $20,000 to save $10,000, and you can get it back up, you just get it back up in an hour and lose that 10 instead of spend 20 to have a hot site. So a company has to look at organization, what they're going to do. So do they have, and so we end up planning for those disasters, and that's another one of the key terms, disaster recovery, and that fits into that business continuity planning. We're identifying in the business continuity planning what are the key things we need to have at least minimalistically up in some kind of an outage or downtime, a hack or breach, a fire, or a natural disaster. So for the other company over here, they got to get their website back up because they make too much money. For me, it could be lower on the priority to get back up. Maybe I just need to get my email back up first so I can get back communicating and make sure jobs are moving, etc. Each company is going to make their own decisions. They're going to prioritize what they need to have be able to bring back up or to have as a spare somewhere. And that can be a hot site ready to go. That can be a cold site where you have to back up data, restore data to it, and then bring it up. But you have to do your analysis and decide where your price points are for your organization. And then another piece that is part of the ongoing effort of a security plan is what we call incident response. Organizations will set up, if they're big enough, an incident response team, or at least have people in the organization tasked with being, okay, Sally's machine got a virus on it, or intrusion detection is going off. It looks like we're really being attacked by a serious set of attackers. Fire off the incident response team, have them come in and begin to, and you develop the procedure. What is the plan? Who's called? Who's communicated? Who's the incident response team? If it's a natural disaster and we're shut down, that's an incident. We're going to call it that. We're activating our disaster recovery plans. What is the procedure for all that? That is all part of organizational security. So an inventory and assessment of what we need, defining of our base policies and procedures to keep us safe, business continuity planning and planning for the future, and then incident response to manage even the day-to-day incidents that happen. A virus happens, a machine goes down, one server is attacked, maybe somebody didn't patch it, and we have to go clean that up. So we have the procedures for that. The last thing I'll say about organizational security is just a repeat. It is not a goal. It's not an end goal. You're going to create one, but it's going to be a constantly evolving set of documents. If your organization changes in any significant way, you're going to end up changing your organization security plan. If you buy another company, you're going to have a whole new set of risk and a whole new set of equipment that you have to merge in, you have to take into account, and you have to manage it under your plan. You may have to add new procedures to handle that new equipment. You may have to update your document to address what your goals are. Maybe they have a lot of older legacy equipment that's going to be harder to secure. So is it going to be that you take additional security steps like sandboxing or whatever to protect those older equipment, or are you going to replace it? And each of those has cost. And so there'll be analysis and potentially debate among seniors, people, and obviously budgets and et cetera come into play. So anyway, that is the last of it. I've unmuted you there, sir. How are you doing today? Sounds like you might be driving.
Yes. Yeah.
I saw you drop in a couple times too, and I thought I heard some like travel noise, weather noise going by. But anyway, I appreciate you driving. You take a class while we're driving down the road. Do you have any questions today for me? I know you popped in and out, so you may have to go back and watch a couple sections once I get the recording posted. But
Right.
well, that's all I have today. If you do, drop me an email or and we'll put it away.
I have no questions.
Okay, great. Well, you have a good afternoon. I'm gonna let you go. It takes a while for this to save it out, and then I'll post it. It'll be posted probably in an hour, so it downloads it. You know, the cloud Zoom meeting makes a copy, and then I have to download it, post it back to YouTube. But
Roger.
you can pick up on the few parts you missed as you driving around.
Correct.
All right.
Thank you, sir. All right, out.